Hey everybody, we are back. Dungeon Dialectics. We are back in the class discussion, and we are talking about Druids. So what do you got for us, Victor? What is the history of Druids?
Well, what is a druid? Well, it's supposed to be a member of the high-ranking professional classes in ancient Celtic cultures, or Celtic. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but you get what I mean. And they were seen as religious leaders, legal authorities, adjudicators, lore keepers, medical professionals, political advisors, and seers. Something interesting to keep in mind, though, or at least interesting to me, it might be interesting to the rest of you as well, is that they didn't actually leave any writings or records. We have no certifiably ancient verses or material, even through translation, that is from the original.
Strictly orators.
Yeah. They were supposedly, according to some sources, they did have writing, but according to their rules, they didn't write any of their teachings down. That's at least what's been supposed. So all we have to go on is some secondhand accounts that are from Romans and later some Christian sources, and they were usually presented as basically as a form of pagans, and it's been debated whether they were simply a different term to use for other nations' religious leaders to present them as somehow primitive and wrong. But that is a bit of a sidetrack to what we're getting at, I suppose. But most of what we refer to, think of as Druids, were reinvented in the 18 and 1900s by neo-pagans of various form that had based their concepts around the idea of what a Druid was and thoughts about what they were actually talking about back in those days, rather than any solid actual evidence or sources.
So when it comes to Druids, we really don't have much. And of what we do, it's from people who weren't too fond of Druids.
Yeah, or at least people who were sort of suspicious of them.
Yeah.
In a sense, though, I feel like that also adds to the mystery that is the Druid, because they are seen as divine in like using some form of divine or natural version of divine power and magic. Yet at the same time, they don't necessarily have specific deities or gods or anything that they worship. And they don't have some sort of pact or agreement like a warlock would have with some sort of primeval force.
Yeah.
So what are they? Well, I guess in some senses, the world itself is their deity.
Yeah, so that's always super interesting to me when it comes to a druid. I'm probably most interested in where you derive your magic from, but that's kind of like all spellcasters for me.
Yeah.
But I'm always a huge fan of a druid who uses animism, where it's just like every spirit of every forest, every spirit of actual entities who have passed, anything that would bestow the druid power through the giving of respect to the natural world. I like that idea. It also narratively, if you're an animism druid, allows the DM a lot of leeway to bring in like, oh, this spirit, in these different scenes. It almost has the like a real soft warlock effect. Where you were like the DM can bring in a bunch of NPCs that can become connected to you in some way. So I do like that, but choosing how your magic is derived and what your rituals are is very important for a druid.
Yeah, and it's also important that we analyze the Druid because, I mean, we've talked about the stereotypical views of classes in the past, and like the stereotypical view of a Druid is a bit of a hippie. Let's just say that. I don't think we need to define a hippie at this point, but
No.
but there's a bit of a some person covered in rags and mold and branches and stuff that talks about natural forces that people in civilization don't understand, and that is based on something, but there are so many more things or so many more versions and flavors of Druid that we could really make something out of if we just take the time to think about it.
Yeah, I really like that aspect of it. I would prefer if that type of druid Like, obviously there's room for any kind of druid, but
Yeah, of course.
I would prefer a druid who understands the balance of nature and civilization, bringing in that neutral where you understand the balance of law versus chaos. I do like that aspect where you don't dislike civilization, but you know where the boundaries should be.
Yeah, because like we're not talking about modern concrete cities with thousands of people and technology. We're talking about somewhat medieval or at least fantasy worlds and atmospheres where where the druid might just think of a city as the human equivalent of an ant-hive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
like an ant-hive is natural.
Yeah, and
essentially,
most of these medieval cities, just because of their low population, not to get into huge economic stuff, but as long as they, put minor focus on it, they need the natural environment to survive. They have it. They require lumber. They require fishing, all these things. So actually, it's more important to these cities for eco protection as long as they're cognizant of it. So a druid would actually be a huge boon for them. A druid who spends time in the city, or maybe even a small village. A druid who lives out into the woods but comes into help. To understand, to regrow lost fields or anything like that. A druid can be a huge boon for a town, and could be almost why a town is created, is because of a druid's aid.
Yeah, and like the things that a village or a city might think of as bad omens or natural disasters or such might just be a druid might just show up and be like, well, that's no more sinister than fire. You just got to know how to treat it right.
Exactly. I do love the narrative sense the druid being the MacGuffin, because like the old wizened druid, you don't actually know how old they are, but they speak about things that happened hundreds of years ago, and you have everything's nice and sweet, and then the druid talks about how this is an unnatural occurrence, yada yada, push you into adventure.
Yeah, and an interesting aspect as well is how if you're making a druid, how associated with civilization or not are they? Because the stereotypical classical one is just part of nature and maybe pulled into civilization by an event, whilst other ideas like I had an idea for a character, and this was before I even knew about the Unearthed Arcana for Circle of Spores, was that was a druid who is literally specialized in making yeast and working with bakeries and making various strains of yeast to make different kinds of bread and stuff. And like, that's what they do for a living. And then things happen and they have to weaponize their skills.
Yeah, I think when you talk about kind of like the natural world, you can really turn that into anything that you want. You can, it's one of the great powers of the human imagination. We can backwards rationalize anything. So if we look at some sort of mechanic from any of the druid circles, you can make that make sense for whatever flavor you want.
Yeah. There's also, of course, in many settings and such, there are deities of nature or various, natural elements and such. And a druid can be directly worshipping or respectful or in relation to these beings, or they can be completely unrelated to them and just be, associating with the nature around them rather than some sort of grand force or power in that sense. But there's also
it is tempting to have a druid who does gain their powers through divine belief. And they use it to have better commune with nature. I do find that it's very interesting. It gets real close to nature domain clerics, but that's not always a bad thing. I think a little bit of bleed is good for character concepts.
Some cross-pollination, if you will.
Yeah, I always think that's good because one, it gives you different flavors. Like if you don't exactly like the mechanics of this, you can always hop over to that, and it doesn't change your character concept that much. And second, it gives, if you're really looking for it, some other characters potentially in your party a lot of interesting connections that they might have. You worry about spotlight overlap as well, but if you're good at sharing the spotlight, a little bit of mechanical overlap is not bad.
Yeah, and we were on talking about the whole concept of the mystique behind what a druid actually is, and this is an interesting element that can be used in other aspects, because as much as a wizard wants to understand and know anything, there are things that we just don't have in book learned form yet. So when does the wizard have to say, damn it, this is not in the archives, call in the weirdo in the weirdo back in the swamp, we'll have to ask him about this.
Yeah. Again, just the mystery of the druid and the world. Kind of most worlds in D&D are like overrun by monsters or nature or magical nature, things like that. So the druid is such a good MacGuffin in all regards. But speaking,
it's an even better version of its magic. I don't have to explain it, because even the magical systems in the world doesn't understand exactly how they work.
Yeah, but speaking strictly on like PCs, it is always interesting when you can set up a scene where the character who, the wizard, tends to always have the right answer for what's going on, but you can set up a scene where they're just flummoxed, and it's the quiet druid who's like, I've seen this before.
yeah, and it's a bit of a staple as well, where you have a druid who doesn't really conform to societal norms or something like that, and they like might think of things in animalistic terms, or like they think of social dynamics. Their idea of social dynamic might be based on a wolf pack or something like that. But sometimes bringing it down to that level can also be really enlightening, because at that point, when you think of them in that light, suddenly things make a whole lot of different sense in other ways. So it can be a very good like perspective shift that helps you understand things that you previously didn't.
Yeah, it's definitely, especially with a lot of other class choices, which tend to be a little bit more civilized. I think the barbarian's basically the only exception to that. You definitely get a much different perspective in the party, and that can be refreshing, and especially useful for scenes for the DM.
Yeah, I think the druid is. If someone told me to make a shaman,
yes,
I would probably base it on the druid.
Yeah,
and maybe just put some flavor on certain things. I wouldn't necessarily change anything mechanically. I would just flavor things and pick specifically for certain things, because I feel like the shaman is mostly druid, potentially a little bit, potentially with a dash of bard, but that's about it.
Yeah, my go-to is always druid or warlock for shaman, because I make quite a few shaman villains. So the warlock, I usually kind of take the warlock skeleton, but then just flesh it out with druidic spells.
Yeah. There's a lot of themes as well that you can have associated with your druid. That is, and many of these are based on like how do you approach the world and how do you think about things. There is, of course, the classical druid has a focus on harmony, but they could also have a focus on concepts like survival of the fittest and the harsh realities of nature. They could have most of us people in the modern Western world have a very linear way to think of time and the world and society, and stereotypically, or generally speaking, for societies before we had a lot of writing and such, and when all that was based around memory, our understanding was very much more cyclical. Everything went in the same patterns, and it was important to remember the patterns and remember how things were, and it was better to remember than it was to invent at that point in society. I think that you can also, if you think about how this kind of pattern works, you can also develop it further. Like, I have an idea that like many druids in my setting have an approach to nature and the world of, rather than linear or cyclical, they think of it as a spiral shape. Like every year has new seasons, but everything is always changing. It's always going somewhere, even if it's moving in a repetitive pattern. And that has certain implications for how you see the world, and like you plan every year for how things are probably going to change for the next year and so on, rather than preparing for things being the same.
Yeah, I also do think that the difference between harmony versus survival of the fittest does sow the seeds for a potentially evil-leaning druid. Druids, I don't think, are considered like first choice for evil characters. They tend not to lend to that with all of their touchy-feely animalness. But I do think an evil druid is something to be considered. Somebody who less has a connection with nature and more sees nature for the tool that it can be. And
or has the mentality of, this is nature as it is, but this is nature as I believe it should be. Or this is nature as the thing I am obsessed with would survive best. Like if there's a druid who is obsessed with fungi, maybe they believe that the tree of life and the natural order and such should be just reshaped to be 90% fungi.
Yeah.
And as such, they want to change the world into something that it is not, rather than preserve what it is.
Yeah, I also like the idea of almost a druid who tests and alters nature to the whim, combining it with magical forces, maybe like the supernatural. Like, taking vampiric blood and seeing what it does to various plants or animals and growing. I think a druid evil PC can work, but I think what a lot of people don't think is evil druids as villains. They can be very powerful. They can be very interesting, especially if you find something to just kind of like that twisting of beauty, just slightly, kind of putting a spin on that, can be very interesting for your narrative.
Yeah, because like if you look at all the abilities and if we may get 5e specific for a moment, the kind of spells that druids often have.
Very violent.
They have a lot of potential damage. They have a potential to essentially personify natural disasters if they really wanted to.
And just about all of them too.
Yeah, and that's because there is a tendency to focus either on the animal tending or the nature tending aspects, but a druid really is. They really cover all of nature, the entire spectrum, while a storm cleric might have the storm, have like the winds and everything, and a earth genasi or whatever is associated with the earth, but a druid really has the entire package to begin with, and then you can figure out if you want to refine it in any one direction or such. But really, the druid is just has just their finger in all of the little aspects that is nature, and you can really emphasize that as a whole.
It would be interesting to have a druid that believes that the peak performance and peak beauty of nature is during natural disasters, so they do everything they can to exacerbate and grow natural disasters with their power. Yeah,
and like there are the villains who know they are evil. There are villains who think they are doing what's good, and that's what's good, but they're doing so in a way where they either don't care about lives, or they don't, or they even feel a sense of, like the most classical example would be society is ruining nature, and therefore I must weaponize nature to ruin society or something like that. The idea that no, I'm not attacking, I'm just rebalancing the board again.
Yeah, it could be a nation that's suffering through basically like complete droughts, infertile fields, so like people are dying by the droves through famine, and this druid is just like, I mean, the only way to do it is hit the reset button, floods, destroy and tear things apart, because what comes from all these floodwaters is actually regrowth in fertile land.
Or it's even a situation where the PCs get to this villain, and And the Druid's like, what? I'm just stopping them from preventing the natural event of things. This area is supposed to be in a drought every 20 years, and they keep trying to lead the rivers the other way. They're not supposed to go that way.
They have these horrible machinations of levees and things like that, and it's overflowing areas, and now the thriving life that used to be in these plains is now a marsh, and has destroyed most of what was, the life that was here. And it could even be friends that I had, 200-year-old like magical giant elk died in the droves because of they had no food because their grasslands drowned.
Yeah, or you destroyed my friends that I've had for the last 200 years. You knew it as Oakwood Forest.
Exactly. Yeah, that whole connection to the natural world is like literal, where things almost like a vengeance druid.
Yeah, but now we're getting into villains as opposed to player characters a bit much.
It's kind of
but it is an interesting underused aspect.
Yeah, but I also think that a lot of these concepts could work perfectly for PCs as well.
I guess what we're trying to get to is that the druid can be a force of destruction if it really wants to. It's not this little pacifist who just sits around messing around with mushrooms and plants. They have a lot of potential to just absolutely break out the destruction when things really get down to it.
Another aspect I always like talking about with spellcasters is their focus, and I mean that in like the literal mechanical terms for 5e. The druidic focus, and I always impress it upon people. It's like, no, pick something that's interesting for your druidic focus. Component pouch is totally fine as well. That's always a good little mainstay, and I think of all classes, I think a druid makes the most sense to have a component pouch. But a druidic focus can be super interesting, some sort of totem or some sort of staff or whatever. But have it evoke questions in the mind. Druids already have that huge mystery about them. Why not continue it?
Yeah, like I like the mental image of, probably almost every one of you who've played Skyrim, I like the idea of the Spriggan heart. That's a tree creature, and they drop a heart-shaped root. And I like to imagine that as a magic focus for the druid or something akin to that.
I also kind of like the idea of maybe the skull or maybe a portion of an old friend. Like an animal, an animal totem, maybe like a wolf skull or something along those lines, or maybe a wand fashioned from an elk horn or something like that. Like
the nose to tail approach to how everything should work out can be very important. In my setting, the druid, the elves, or at least the wood elves, their idea of burial is not to preserve anything, but to let everything go back into the natural order of things. And then you have a location that is dedicated to remembering this person, but that this person is now back with nature.
Yeah, I like the idea of having the Elk Horn Totem, but all of the spells are manifest because of the past elk friend that was 200 years old before it passed. Every spell is manifest from its spirit. So from everything from conjure animals to flaming sphere, it's actually manifestations of that spirit taking form into that magic. And it's almost like you have the animal companion, but it's a spirit that it is always with you, and it's a friend that will never leave your side.
Yeah, it's the friendship version of a warlock.
Yeah.
I really like that idea.
Yeah, I do. Yeah. Is there anything else that we need to talk about for druids?
Well, there's also the question of how taught or self-taught your druid is. And I think that can be much more interesting than a lot of people will give it credit for, because a self-taught druid, a druid that has had no one teach them, that is an interesting. How did you get to these things? Did it come naturally to you, or did you associate with? Did you move around environments where you learned these things through the environment, or maybe if you had one master teacher, maybe that person had a specific twist to how they do things or their approach, and that has influenced how you do things? or if you're in part of a circle, then there's the question, and this is also involved if you have a single teacher, what is this teacher's approach to society and the natural order? How do they define the natural order, and so on? And how much do you or do you not embody their idea of all these things? Because it's often more interesting to have. It's often very interesting to have characters who don't necessarily follow it, like a paladin that works or a druid that works with their organization, but has some personal flavor to how they think it should be done, rather than just following everything by the book. I think that's a lot of gives space for interesting elements and for development between your character and the organization they came from.
Yeah.
Are you trying to teach your origin organization how that this might be a better way to do it, or is your organization telling you to go away and do this other task because they don't want you influencing the new ones who shouldn't, according to them, think like you do, or something?
I really do, and I've used it a couple times, the aspect of Druid learns from their master from a young age. So they grow up for years being taught by the old, wizened, very noble Druid. Come to find out either through conversation or meeting that their master is actually part of a circle. But the way that the circles work in my world, they don't actually work closely together. A circle is basically a coven of Druids who they have their own groves, or if they're not forests, they have their own lands that they take care of, but when great need arises, they will come together to form the circle to decide which way they will go as a circle and how they'll deal with it. And that may be the first time that this character actually sees the circle proper. They may have heard names or like friends and things like that, but they actually see the coming together and feeling that power of like 3 or more archdruids coming together, and how incredible that is. I've also used it before where one of the circle actually falls, becomes some sort of evil, and then the student is sent to deal with that problem as kind of a rite of passage. That you have to take out a fallen master. Usually because something has happened to either harm or waylay the master, and they are not able to take care of it.
And then the question becomes, did this specific, the fallen druid, have a specific domain? And will you get responsibility over this specific domain if you manage to solve the problem solve the problem however it may be? Will you be given this responsibility? And is that a responsibility you want, or just one that you were expected to take because this is your task?
And it may also be based on how you deal with the problem. This may be some ultimate test that kind of talking in that cycle thing, that maybe druids are reticent to start circles because they know in the repeating nature that one will always fall within the circle. It will always happen. It repeats, it rhymes. And the next generation of druids has to deal with that problem, and how they deal with it is basically the impetus on whether or not the teaching was done correctly and the knowledge was passed on properly, if the lesson stuck.
Yeah, and the lesson doesn't necessarily have to be a good or an evil or a neutral one. It can be whatever makes sense for that specific circle. You might think that, the circle tells me to deal with this problem, but if I can capture them and send them get them imprisoned or something, and bring them to the circle, that'll be the task. But maybe the circle has more of the focus on the cycle that, no, this person needs to die.
You need to,
because that's the way.
You need to cut the chaff.
Yeah, you need to cut the chaff. You need to trim the bush for it to grow better next year. And it is wrong of you to leave this person alive. And that might be the approach that you get. And at that point, your character may have to decide: is this what I want to associate with, or do I want to break out of this and do my own thing?
And that could be an excellent call to adventure after like a first tier 1 arc or something like that, where it's like, no, like I can't be a part of this anymore. And then the master disappointed, like, I spent so much time on you. I thought you were going to be one, the one, and you don't have it in you to be part of this circle.
Yeah, there is a lot of potential things you can do with so many different aspects of druids, because and as we've spoken of with the bard and with with the barbarian and so on, that there are stereotypes that there's nothing wrong with having them, but let's go beyond them. Let's do something more.
At least sometimes. I mean, it's not a requirement. I do think tropes have their place, especially for newer players that are trying to experience D&D. It's like they want those things, you know, they want goblins, they want all that stuff. But I do think there's ways to branch beyond that. One thing for one small mention before we bounce out that Druids have basically in all systems and in all editions is wild shape. You know, you got to think about, put a little bit of emphasis on how does wild shape manifest? Is this literally change of form, or is this a almost like a magical or spiritual cocooning around you that you become, where it's almost like an astral projection of this creature? And also kind of one thing I always want to impart on people that are druids is that with wild shape and magic, there is a huge capability and tendency to step on spotlight. You know, nothing's much better at scouting than like a spider, a tiny spider. So, well, we just took away the rogue spotlight of being able to stealth around and look, you know, and scout and see what's going on ahead. Few things are stronger than a grizzly bear, so you just took away the fighter or the barbarian's ability to lift stuff. And you could keep going on with it. That wild shape can really step on a lot of people's toes, and I would impart on druid players to, instead of taking spotlight, learn to enhance the spotlight of other people. Maybe instead of being a spider that checks out and scouts the whole fortress without any risk associated with it, maybe you become a rat instead, or like a cat, and you work with the rogue to unlock things that they wouldn't be able to normally, and so on and so forth. Just think of ways, instead of to be a kind of a downer for your party, way to increase their ability at the table.
Yeah, like I've mentioned Frosker in the past, and he was a druid themed around frogs and toads, and his thing was like, you know, the giant frog and the giant toad, they have the ability to grab things and try to eat them, basically. But if you don't succeed at eating them, you've at least grappled at the target, and now all of the other people can start doing whatever they want to the target, and now you're the guy locking other enemies down, or at least distracting them because they keep having to try and break out a grapple every turn. And you can really like find your niche without stepping on other people's niches if possible. And like sometimes it can be good to turn into that grizzly bear, but do it to join the barbarian or the fighter to be able to muscle away that boulder or break open that door or whatever it is. Don't do it because you'd want to do it instead of them.
Yeah, and that would just be my PSA for this one: is enhance the party, don't step on toes. Did you have anything else for druids?
No, just that I really enjoy them, and there's a lot of I always say that there's so many things you could do, but it really is true, and especially with the mysterious element of what is a druid really, because even with the stuff we have said here, and even with the material in the book, you can really imagine some very like technically a druid and a warlock could be following the same being, but just have very different approaches to it.
Yeah.
Like if you have a fey warlock and a druid, the druid might have one approach where they just sort of associate with the fey just more like a bypasser who happens to know how to interact with their neighbors, while the warlock is more of a let's make a deal.
Yes. And to your point of there's so many options, it's like we wouldn't be doing the series if there wasn't. Hopefully we're opening the eyes of other people who may just see everything as only the stereotypes. Open it up a little bit, and sprinkle in some uniqueness to your characters that doesn't always involve funny hats. So.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we will see you on the next one. Thank you so much. Once again, as always, thank you, Victor, for joining me. This is an amazing time. Yeah. All right.
Same.
We will see you on the next one when we talk about fighters. Bye.